Lili by Martin Sanders Whiteley. Chapter 13 Flight from Death. Or more accurately, as I approached the door of the castle, I was quickly pulled out of potential sight by Carmilla, ducking behind a statue of the Reaper. Why would the castle have a statue of the Reaper? And taking me with her. That, she said, is how you end up like all the other immortals I've ever known. Excluding Laura and your other friends. Hopefully. Instead, we went around to the side of the castle. Carmilla pointed at an angular window, several feet above us, well out of reach to my eyes. Do you really expect me to climb up there? I asked, glaring at Carmilla in spite of my fear. Of course not, groaned Carmilla, rolling her eyes. I'm still not sure how someone who is centuries old can still maintain the snarky attitude of a teenager. Indeed, in spite of the hints of decay in her appearance, she looked no older than 17. I suppose she had never been required to be anything else. We could climb there, quite easily, she continued, but God knows what would get under our nails. Do you believe in God? I asked, wondering if an older, more experienced vampire would have some knowledge of what lies beyond death that I didn't have. Carmilla simply shrugged. I haven't really thought about it, she admitted. Anyway, she continued, I was going to say that we're going to be flying. Judging by your question, you've never flown before. Gone was her snarky attitude at this point. Now she was willing to do whatever it took to save my friends, or at least save Laura. Except get dirt under her nails, apparently. Carmilla did have monstrously sharp fingernails that would probably break while we climbed, but it seemed a poor excuse to me. And flying? I had read stories about vampires that could fly in the form of bats, but I had assumed that these were fantasy. I hadn't been able to turn into a bat, but I hadn't tried. I hadn't tried to do any of the things that I hadn't been able to do while I was alive. They had happened instinctively as a result of intense emotions. That's essentially how you do it, said Carmilla, who seemed to be picking something out of her teeth. I decided I'd rather not know what. I realized she'd read my mind and became furious. Why did she insist on replying to my thoughts out loud if she could respond telepathically, and why couldn't I read her thoughts? Because, Carmilla responded, Her eyes widened in sudden realization of something, but she quickly regained her usual demeanor. No time for that now, she dismissed my mental question. As I was saying, that's essentially how you do it, through intense emotion. You need to get through the window. You have to do it. So, Carmilla instantly changed into a leathery winged bat, blending into the night yet still unmistakably her. The bat's fur was darker than that of a normal bat, and its movement had something of Carmilla's attitude in it as it glided to the angular window, a way of lazily gliding on the wind until it seemed it might collapse, then flitting forward with sudden intensity. And then the bat was a mess of golden brown hair and black velvet, two eyes glinting down at me, cat-like in the darkness. You do, Carmilla finished, completing the sentence I had almost forgotten she had started. I took a deep breath, even though I didn't need one, and prepared myself to jump, but was overcome by doubt and sat on the ground instead. In an instant, I was on my feet again, my hair being pulled upright by Carmilla, who was suddenly right next to me. Don't fall into a pitiful pile of self-doubt now, she screamed directly in my face. After all, that window stands between you and the reason you're here. As much as I hated Carmilla's aggression, it only made me feel worse about myself. I quickly realized she had a point. Laura was why I had come all this way, and she was the reason that scream of energy had erupted from me. if that same energy could transform me. Before I even realized what had happened, I was on the windowsill, Carmilla next to me, crouching like a cat with a tangled mane of brown, my eyes reflecting in hers. "That was quicker than I expected," she said. "Now, see if you can do this." The strands of twisted golden brown hair suddenly aged before my eyes, becoming whiter, thinner, wispier, until they appeared to be nothing but a silvery mist. It took me a moment to realize that Carmilla was just that. A mist, slowly seeping under the window. I soon saw the process reversed, and the moonlight reflected off Carmilla's eyes in the dark of the room. "Now, you try." Now that I felt more confident in my abilities, turning to mist came easily. It was not like the instantaneous flutter of consciousness that was the bat. It was more gradual, like falling asleep. And while in that dreamlike mist state, it took effort to direct myself underneath the window. But I soon found that I was regaining my own solid consciousness. This room, the same bedroom as before, was dark. The same could not be said of the other rooms. From under the door we could see a warm glow, laced with burning menace. Cutting through what I guessed was firelight were silhouettes of people's ankles, restlessly pacing the floor. I guessed that there were 2 men in the room. Carmilla nodded her agreement. I still don't know how you came to the conclusion that it was vampires," said one voice, a mid-range British stutter. "I thought we were done with that sort of thing." "I had to be sure we were rid of the Fiend and his mark forever," said another voice, thick with an accent I couldn't quite place. "So I made a thorough investigation, which, as you know, brought us here. I have tracked down Lucy and Miss Mina, and set them free." Carmilla grabbed my hand to calm me. I realized that I had been shaking, not out of fear, but out of rage. The voice with the unknown accent continued its speech. "I think the things that were in Miss Mina and Lucy's bodies," Carmilla gripped my hand tighter, "and that other demon we staked were the last of this plague. But we should search this place to make sure." I could barely stand the rage burning inside me at this point. Carmilla looked into my eyes, mouthed, "Go ahead," and let go of my hand. I found myself on all fours, the door splintered behind me. A tall, thin man, to whom I guessed the mid-range stutter belonged, screamed in agony as I bit into his throat. This neither confirmed nor denied my theory, as the only sounds he could make were the cracked garglings of the blood in his throat. I soon found myself with a crucifix shoved in my face. An unearthly howl escaped my lips involuntarily. Shadow-like, Carmilla glided behind the man holding the cross. An older, bespectacled man, I guessed that the thick, accented voice belonged to him, and dug her clay-like nails into his back. He instantly spun around, turning the crucifix on Carmilla. She dropped to her hands and knees, emitting a gravelly hiss. She was practically drowning in her tangled hair. She skittered spider-like up the wall and onto the ceiling at an uncannily fast pace. Shaking a bit more than before, but still unmoved, the man kept the crucifix pointed at Carmilla, and kept his eyes locked on her. I saw this as my opportunity. I lunged at the man, jumping on his back, much as Carmilla had. Before he could react, Carmilla dropped from the ceiling, landing upright. The man had dropped the crucifix in the struggle, and Carmilla kicked it aside. It skidded across the floor, clinking lightly against the stone wall. As if expecting this, the man pulled something out of the pocket of his heavy coat, crumpling it in a circle around him. I tried stepping into the circle, but my leg refused to move forward. I tried leading with the other leg. It didn't budge either. I realized that I was physically incapable of stepping into the circle. Communion wafer. Carmilla spat contemptuously. She then actually spat contemptuously onto the crumpled wafer surrounding the man. It instantly burst into flames that leapt up to his eye level. Now, said Carmilla, circling the flaming ring in a motion somewhere between pacing and an animal circling its prey. What is your name? Abraham Van Helsing, said the man, little more than a flickering shadow masked by the firelight. I have worked years to destroy your kind. And I have spent centuries watching the ones I love die at the hands of people like you, retorted Carmilla, spitting in his direction again. The flames rose still higher, menacingly close to the man's face. I do not fear fire, death nor undeath, said Van Helsing, trying to act unfazed by the flames. He then pulled out a small vial and poured its contents on the infernal circle. The fire immediately went out. Holy water, I thought. Carmilla gave a slight nod of confirmation. She then turned a fierce gaze on Van Helsing, who had stepped out of the circle and was rushing towards the door. Van Helsing's eyes instantly went extremely wide, and he began clutching his head in pain. After a few minutes of screaming and convulsing on the floor, Van Helsing began to speak. Those you seek are in the courtyard. The man gasped as if the air had turned sickeningly thin. He suddenly seemed as old as he looked. I know nothing of this Laura you speak of. Carmilla, who had been as motionless as a wax figure through all of this, blinked. Van Helsing's agony apparently stopped. He was breathing heavily and sweating. Thank you, said Carmilla coldly. Now sit in that corner until we come back. She pointed at a cobweb-glazed corner of the room where two rats were having a conversation beyond our comprehension. Van Helsing quickly obeyed, tearing the fabric of the cobwebs as he sat down. The two rats scattered from the corner, squeaking rat curses back at him. As we walked toward the door, Carmilla let a quiet snicker escape her mouth. What is it? I asked. I just thought of a joke, she said, but it's hard to explain. And I don't want you trying to read my mind. We proceeded down to the courtyard with caution, but luckily encountered no one. We found two wooden coffins in the shadows created by the balconies above. We opened them and found Lucy and Mina with stakes through their hearts. After de-staking them, they quickly showed us where Cassie had been staked and buried. It was the coffin we had found Carmilla in. As expected, Laura was nowhere to be found. However, neither was Clarissa. You couldn't bother to ask where she was? I thought, staring intently at Carmilla. I forgot, she said simply, shrugging in something that could have been embarrassment or carelessness. We were actually ambushed by a mob of the villagers, said Mina. Clarissa managed to stave most of them off by herself. She didn't even kill most of them, Lucy added. Most of them ran away, they were terrified. She did everything I'd always read about vampires doing in books, Cassie interjected happily, grinning with pride and showing off the blood-encrusted tips of her fangs. Wolf, bat, mist, all of it. This was a bit frustrating, as I'd hoped they would be more surprised and excited when I told them about my newfound transformation abilities. But that was relatively unimportant, so I let them continue. But Carmilla didn't. You can be proud of your friend later, she said, marching out of the shadows. Right now you need to tell us what happened, and get to the point. The others were startled by Carmilla's sudden appearance. Don't worry, she said. She seemed to barely be able to contain her impatience. I don't know if I like you, but I can't stand seeing immortals like us wiped out. It's ironic how many mortalities there are among the so-called immortals. But we waste time. What happened? Well, began Mina, clearly struggling to take all this information in. After getting rid of the villagers, Clarissa ran off into the woods, in wolf form. We haven't seen her since. Mina stopped for a moment. She appeared to be choking back tears. Then we were ambushed by the two men I trusted most in my life. Abraham Van Helsing, who tried to save my life, and my father. Oh my God. What had I done to her father? Carmilla must have read my thoughts because she turned to Mina. About that, Carmilla said with a voice that wore a mask of false tenderness, and was making little effort to keep the mask from falling off. Lili may have ripped your father's throat out. I saw no change in the expression on Mina's face, but drops of scarlet began running down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, I began, but Mina waved her hand to silence me. It's fine, she said, a bitterness in her voice that implied otherwise. Anyway, interjected Lucy, attempting to break the tension in the air. What about Van Helsing? He's sitting in the corner of the bedroom like the obedient child he is, said Carmilla with a voice like marble. We have all the information we'd need now, so I suppose we should try to find Laura, and what was the other one called? Clarissa? Yes, her. Chapter 14. Lunar Light. As we walked into the forest, we began to talk. First, the conversation was mental, but Carmilla soon made us speak out loud as she could not safely use her mental voice with us. She was hesitant in explaining her mental voice to the others, just as she had cut off her explanation to me. But why? After all, I already knew about her mental voice, had experienced it firsthand, albeit in a dream. And she could read my thoughts, so she must have known about the dream. If Carmilla had read my thoughts in this moment, she did not acknowledge it. We continued our walking and conversing. We can't very well go back to the inn after what happened with the villagers, Lucy reasoned. I suppose we'll have to sleep in the forest, but how will we shield ourselves from the sunlight? I asked. Carmilla quickly transformed into a wolf. I had not seen my own wolf form from the outside, but Carmilla's seemed darker, sleeker than mine. Everything about Carmilla had an aspect of graceful terror that I envied. She knocked down a small tree, uprooting it with surprising strength even for her. She quickly turned back to her regular form and pulled from her pocket. Her dress had pockets? What was either some kind of ritual dagger or the equivalent of a pocket knife. I guessed it was the former, as it had an unusually ornate golden handle and formidably curved edges. We'll have to make coffins for ourselves, she said. But we don't have any nails, or our native soils for that matter, Lucy pointed out, digging the flesh of something disgusting out of her teeth as discreetly as she could. You're wrong on that second point, said Carmilla, producing a series of vials from another pocket in her dress. How many pockets did this dress have? And handed one to each of us. I managed to get a little soil from the remains of each of your coffins. As for nails, we don't need them. We can just hollow out these trees. How do you expect us to do that? Interrupted Cassie, with only one knife and only so much light left. Not only one knife, corrected Carmilla, pulling out an identical dagger for each of us from her pocket. I wondered if her pockets were somehow bottomless. "Get to work," she said in a tone that would seem unreasonably bossy if it weren't for the fact that she had already started hollowing out her tree. We spent the remaining hours of darkness hollowing out trees, cutting a piece of the trunk off the top to use as a lid. I knocked down the rest of the trees, as Carmilla was busy, and the others didn't know how to turn into wolves yet. They were still a bit surprised by my transformation, but after what they had told me about Clarissa, I knew it wouldn't have the effect that I had hoped for. It was a grueling and unpleasant night, but we miraculously finished the coffins and were in them before sunrise. Even more miraculously, I managed to finish without getting a single splinter. Carmilla, however, managed to get a small one under her fingernail, and the swearing that ensued made me crack a smile due to the curses she was using being extremely obsolete. "It's only a splinter," I said. "It can't be much worse than having a stake through your heart." "At least the stake killed me," she spat back. "I have to suffer through this." She looked down at the minuscule piece of wood under her nail as if it was going to start chewing a hole in her finger at any given moment. We were in our makeshift coffins by sunrise. The next night, a full moon was hanging in the otherwise cloudy sky, colored a waxy yellow. The rest of us had already emerged from our coffins, but Carmilla hadn't yet. Then I heard a shriek, followed by a string of hideous curses. Carmilla emerged from her coffin, clutching her hands and muttering under her breath. She had gotten another splinter. A fog had begun to coat the ground, twisting around our ankles and the bases of the trees. A wind began to blow through the gnarled sculptures of bark, causing them to creak and rustle. A groaning howl came from the branches of a few trees. Except I didn't feel any wind. The rustling and howling continued, coupled with some snarling and low growling. Several pairs of hungry yellow eyes appeared around us from all angles as the low growl multiplied, becoming a chorus of vicious voices that grew louder. Out of the mist came the head of a wolf for each pair of eyes. Their fur was a muddied gray. Their eyes gleamed with hunger and an unsettling intelligence. But there was a shadow of sadness behind each pair as well. They bared their teeth and began to circle us. Carmilla gritted her teeth and pulled one of the splinters out from under her fingernail. She then pulled out her dagger and yelled over the increasing snarl for us to do the same. We went back to back as the wolves continued to circle. From a moon's eye view, it must have looked like some elaborate ritual dance, as we all had our swords pointed directly out in front of us. Then, the wolves parted directly in front of me, the mist parting with them. Into the circle stepped a huge black wolf, with burning red eyes, eyes that had almost burned to ash. These eyes were angrier, hungrier than those of the other wolves, and they contained more intelligence and sadness than the rest. And then the black fur began to yellow, until it was a tangled mess of blonde hair, crusted with mud and mingled with twigs and leaves. And the wolf was not a wolf, but Clarissa.